Hey, so in round two, I was paired against international master Denys Shmelov, and I was playing black. And we've played a couple of times before. I think he's been white in every single game that we've played. In fact, he won the previous game, so I was definitely hoping to get some revenge because he pretty much mainly plays like d4, c4. I'm strictly a King's Indian player these days, and so we typically just have these like King's Indian battles. For the most part, he's gone for the classical main line, which he sticks to in this game, and bishop e2, castles, knight f3. In this game, I decided to play e5. Previously against him, I'd played knight a6, and I'd also tried knight bd7, so I figured it's time to try the classical main line, knight c6, d5, knight e7, and he went for the bayonet attack with b4. Which I think is still a pretty dangerous weapon these days and not easy for King's Indian players to deal with. That said, I do think I was pretty comfortable in the opening. I played a5. He goes bishop a3. B takes a5 is another move, kind of leads to a different kind of line. I took on b4, bishop takes b4, b6, and a4. So the battle lines here are pretty clear. White is kind of trying to just open lines on the queen side, play a5, knight b5, and then try to target this c7 pawn in the long run. Black's play is pretty much going to be on the king side here, trying to push f5. And I think this is kind of... well, it's a reasonable idea, of course, in these King's Indian positions, but it can be a little bit slow. On the other hand, White's play is not that quick. White's play is not that quick either, so I think both sides can certainly have a lot to be happy about in the position. So I play knight e8. This is one of the couple of moves Black can choose from. I think rook e8 is also interesting, knight d7. The point of this move is, of course, to free the f-pawn to move forward, and the knight also covers d6 and c7 here. One of the main ideas is that if White pushes a5, Black has a nice counter with c5. And if the bishop goes back, then the pawn on a5 will be lost. And after d takes c6, knight takes c6, we can see this knight on e8 is super important, covering the d6 pawn. White's bishop is under attack, and Black is going to be winning the pawn on a5. So this isn't so good for White. Okay, so White can't push a5. He decides to go knight b5. I played f5, knight d2, and I think my knowledge ran out somewhere around here. I was pretty sure I looked at this position in my preparation at some point, but I just couldn't remember, what move I was supposed to make. Maybe bishop d7 I thought was quite logical. But yeah, I was basically on my own here and trying to make decisions. At this point, I think one move that Black should definitely avoid in these types of positions is like pushing f4 too early, because then White can play bishop g4 and try to trade off the light-squared bishops. I think, yeah, bishop d7 would have been reasonable here as well. I chose bishop h6, which at the board felt pretty logical, just putting some pressure on d2. And I'm also setting up the bishop to work just on a much better diagonal. It really discourages White from playing f3, because then I always get bishop e3 check, which might be unpleasant, followed by f4 and shutting everything down. So yeah, I felt like this was a reasonable move. Denys thought for a little bit here, played rook a3, which I think is also reasonable. And yeah, here I wasn't sure what to do. Eventually I ended up just playing c5 without White having played a5. I'm not so sure about this move. It's really double-edged, let's say. I think bishop d7 would have kept things a lot more solid. In fact, if White pushes a5, I can, let's say, trade on a5 and even take on b5 at some point, and this seems like a pretty solid position for Black despite losing the light-squared bishop. I think the structure, it kind of favors the knights because it's like very closed and blocked up, and a lot of the play is going to be happening on the king side, and Black's knights might be suited quite nicely for that. Not to mention, Black might be threatening simply to take on e4 and then think about taking this pawn on d5 at the right moment. So okay, I'm not really sure if my move is bad or not. I think it was definitely reasonable, and just leads to a really double-edged position, because he took on passant, knight takes c6, bishop c3, And basically things have opened up a little bit. Black now has some weaknesses, especially the d6 pawn can be considered a serious weakness. The d5 square is also weak. And actually the structure now resembles a Sicilian, almost like a Kalashnikov Sicilian or Sveshnikov, which I thought was pretty interesting. I wasn't exactly sure how to evaluate the position, but to my eyes it just seemed like, okay, white's knight has a very hard time of getting to d5, so that'll take a couple moves if that's the plan he wants to go for. The other knight is also very far away from d5, so maybe white can't utilize the square. And after a move like bishop e6, it just seemed like black has some reasonable development. It's also not so easy for white to play with the pawns on a4 and c4 constantly being under attack, so I wasn't sure if white is so comfortable in this position either. Okay, he ends up taking on f5. I play g takes f5 and knight f3. So the reason he exchanged is so he could free his knight, and now it definitely feels like black's king here might potentially be a little bit weak with the center having been opened up already. But I wasn't too worried. In fact, I was quite optimistic about having this open g-file. And so pretty soon I started with rook c8, but my intention here was to quickly go like king h8, rook g8, and just pile up on the g file and see if I can get some play. But I figured I'd start with this move. It seemed like a healthier move to play, like defending the knight on c6, also lining up the rook on the c file where it can put some nice pressure. Because I knew like black doesn't necessarily have to play on the king side, can also play on the queen side and play against white's weaknesses. Okay, so he played bishop d2. It's actually a really interesting move because he's trying to trade off the dark squared bishops, which I think would be definitely in white's favor. If the bishops come off, then black's king already just feels a lot weaker, and yeah, also white gets mobilized a little bit faster. And if I pull back bishop g7, then I lose control over the g5 square, and knight g5, for example, might be quite unpleasant here. Bishop g5 is also a possibility. So I wasn't too keen on giving up that square. And that kind of left me with this move f4, which feels very anti-positional because the King's Indian, you know, you're typically not supposed to give up the e4 square like that. And if white is able to just immediately bring the knight to e4 and play bishop d3, then white would have a very, very comfortable game and probably a serious edge. But to me, yeah, it just felt like dynamically this is kind of what I had to do. I didn't want to trade bishops and I didn't want to pull back. Queen f6 also seemed kind of suspicious because I don't think I think I wanted to keep the bishop. So yeah, I decided just to well, give up the e4 square, but fight for it soon, because I will have some counterplay in the form of like knight f6, and with my rook still on the c file, if white plays knight c3, for example, I have ideas of playing knight a5 and simply capturing on c4. And if I can take the c4 pawn, then I think that would just be good for black. You know, white has a nice square on e4, but black would be material ahead. Oops. So after f4, white decided to go bishop d3, which I think is definitely reasonable. I played knight f6, which to me looked also like the most logical move in the position, just trying to fight for this key square. Apparently rook f7 was a stronger choice, which is a thematic move in this type of position, just to bring the rook to g7, potentially bringing the bishop back to f8 before that to cover the d6 pawn. And yeah, I feel like, yeah, black gets some pretty reasonable play in this position. It looks like an awkward position to play, but the d6 pawn does have a lot of defenders, and yeah, not so easy for white to put more pressure on it. Okay, so knight f6, queen b1. Yeah, Stockfish didn't like this move either. It was suggesting rook e1, just fighting for the e4 square this way, or even bishop c3, which is an interesting move, just improving the bishop and putting some pressure on this diagonal. But okay, queen b1 looked normal to me. I finally played king h8. He goes rook d1, rook g8, king h1, and now I play queen d7. So at this point, I felt extremely comfortable with my position. I felt like white has no pressure against d6 and b6. I've made a bunch of moves on the king side now, and I'm ready to maybe mobilize. Of course, I'm looking for like bishop h3 ideas, bishop g4, knight g4, all kinds of sacrificial ideas. Yeah, it just seemed like black has a free hand to attack on the king side, which is always nice. But I think Denys tried to defend here as best he could, and he goes rook g1, which It makes sense, kind of admitting his mistake of like putting the rook on d1, but yeah, he just realized this rook is going to be absolutely crucial, so he didn't really care that he's like wasting a tempo. I played bishop f8. I think, yeah, useful move in the position, just covering d6, bishop c3, and queen g7. So I kind of stick to my plan of like just trying to put some pressure on the king side. Queen h6, knight g4, and then looking for some kind of sacrificial attack. But I rejected the right move here, which was almost just a very simple and straightforward move, knight a5, which I considered quite heavily, and I definitely wish I had played it, because now it just feels like so obvious that black is getting a good position here. I mean, the main point is that the c4 pawn is under huge pressure. White kind of has to take the knight on a5, b takes a5, and this dark square bishop, I mean, is a huge piece that white has now given up, and so I think black is simply better here. For example, rook c3, queen f7, and the c4 pawn is still a big target. Black's dark square bishop, once it gets out, it can be a really strong piece. Yeah, and it's still like white has to worry about the king side stuff as well, because like queen h5 is coming, bishop g4, knight g4, all these ideas are in the position. E4 is always a potential threat, and so it turns out white is just under big pressure there. So okay, queen g7. He played rook a2, which I think made sense, just covering the f2 pawn. Queen h6, and I feel like this, yeah, is basically where black starts to go wrong, because I totally overlooked a nice idea for him, bishop f5, just like forcing the light squared bishops off the board, which really helps white in this position, because black is left with all of these weaknesses on the light squares, and I lose my powerful attacking bishop. So instead of queen h6, I should have, again, just played knight a5, and I think black is a really comfortable position. Or, okay, even going back queen d7 and not allowing bishop f5 at all. Okay, after bishop f5, I played knight g4. I felt like things are still somewhat okay here. He takes on e6, queen takes e6, h3, knight f6, rook d2, bishop e7. Now the position has definitely, I think, calmed down a bit, and it feels like black is still okay. I wasn't sure if I was still better or not, just because the bishops have come off, and now the situation has kind of changed. There were some ideas here. I could take on c4, but I think in this line, white simply takes on d6, and black's position kind of opens up, and yeah, once I lose this d6 pawn, the e5 pawn is also super weak, and so my king is going to end up in big trouble. If I take on c3 here, I think white takes on c8, and yeah, it seemed like these lines weren't quite working for black during the game. White is also threatening like rook c1 now, and yeah, all of black's pieces are kind of hanging. So okay, I decided to just keep it solid, bishop e7, rook d1, and yeah, here I should have just played knight e8. I decided to go for the complications with queen takes c4. I thought it was quite working for black, but it turns out I really miscalculated here, or at least underestimated white's resources. So knight e8 would have just kind of kept, I think, the game closer to equal, just kind of defending d6. Now c4 is hanging, white has to defend it. And yeah, game continues. I still have some ideas on the g file, so white doesn't exactly have such a free hand here, but yeah, for sure white is probably no longer worse. So in the game, I end up taking on c4. White takes on d6. I took on c3. Knight takes c8. Rook takes c8. So yeah, some really interesting complications kind of evolve here. I end up getting two pieces for the rook. But I realized that it was not so good, because white is going to be getting some counterplay on the c file, and black's pieces here just simply end up under a lot of pressure. Rook on c8 is hanging, knight on c6 is hanging, bishop, other knight are kind of unstable as well, e5 pawn. So black's position is very tenuous here, and holding on basically by a thread. So queen a5, he played queen f5, and at this point I should say I think Denys was getting in pretty heavy time trouble. I feel like I had more time than him, but not that much more, so it was really getting pretty critical here. And so yeah, now queen f5 is hitting the rook. I go rook c7, rook dc2 is played, According to Stockfish, rook dd1 was a really strong move. I think the idea here is that well, currently white cannot take on e5 with the knight as he would like to because the rook on d2 is hanging, so rook dd1 solves that problem, and now knight takes e5 is a pretty serious threat, and it doesn't feel like black actually has a good response to this. So this move I think would have been very strong and very hard to deal with, but it was also kind of tough to find when rook dc2 just looks so much more natural from a human point of view, just piling up on the c6 knight. But actually, surprisingly, black is kind of okay here after queen d5. He takes on e5, and I'm kind of fortunate to have this resource with knight d4, counterattacking his queen and his rook. He had already calculated this before he played knight takes e5, because otherwise it looks like white could even be in trouble here with all of his pieces hanging as well. But he has knight g6 check, and we basically go into this forced line. I take queen d5, knight d5, rook c7, knight takes c7, and rook takes c7. So yeah, from afar I was kind of expecting this position, and I felt like, okay, material-wise, black is doing fine. White has like rook and pawn for the two pieces, which is, supposed to be around equal. But of course, it's very important that black does not lose the b6 pawn here, because if I lose the b6 pawn and white gets a passed a pawn, then this a pawn is going to be very dangerous. And in fact, it's kind of exactly what white wants when playing with like rook against bishop and knight. White wants like an outside passed pawn, active rook, and white wants black not to have any passed pawns, which I don't. And yeah, I realized it would actually not be so easy to defend this b6 pawn, because, okay, for example, bishop c5 immediately runs into a5, and this passed a pawn is going to be extremely annoying. Knight e6 there would allow rook c6 or even rook c8 check, and then pushing a6 and a7. So bishop c5 is not working. Bishop b4 is also kind of not so good because of rook c4, just forking the two pieces, and then bishop c5, a5 again is a big problem. So I ended up playing bishop f8, which was kind of my idea from before. But somehow here I just totally miscalculated, because after rook c4, I realized that I don't have a good move. Knight e6 just walks into rook c6, and I lose the b6 pawn. And after bishop c5, which was played in the game, white has a5, and this passed a pawn just becomes incredibly strong. So yeah, this was kind of a strange blunder, because I feel like if I just spent a little bit more time, I would have kind of found the right move here, which was bishop d6. And after this move, I think black is actually holding. It looks a little scary because the pieces are loose, but objectively white doesn't really have a whole lot they can do after rook c4, knight b3. So the point is I'm just covering the a5 square, and I'm securing the bishop to come to c5. So now rook c6, bishop c5, rook takes g6. I can take on f2, and black should be holding this pretty comfortably because the bishop can cover both pawns. The knight is free to move around, the king is normally placed, and yeah, white will have a very hard time making progress here. So yeah, I feel like if I just spent maybe an extra minute here, I don't remember exactly how much time I have. It probably wasn't more than like 4 or 5 minutes, but I think this was still holdable. So bishop f8, he goes rook c4, and yeah, I didn't really consider the move knight e2 here so seriously. I mean, this move has the advantage that, knight e6, rook c6, I get hit with another double attack. Knight e2, white can't really do that, has to play, well, if white plays rook c6, I think the key resource that black has to keep in mind here is that we have bishop c5, and now if a5, bishop takes f2, this is kind of the big idea that saves black in this position. The point being that knight g3, knight f1 check is now just going to be perpetual. So whatever white does, a6, white can go knight g3 and save the game this way. And if white tried to stop this with like h4 or something, then black would be in time to simply take on a5, and black would be perfectly fine. Okay, so this was kind of like a computer defense, because The only reason this move works is because of this trick with the perpetual. So it would be pretty hard to spot, in time trouble. But I feel like I should have I should have at least considered the move a little bit harder, and maybe I would have found the idea. I mean, with like 3-4 minutes, I think it's well, it should be doable because all of the other moves are clearly losing. Like if black loses another pawn, for example, knight f5, and rook takes f4, it's a very difficult position to hold. In fact, I think white can probably go, well, okay, rook c6 here would kind of run into the same line with bishop c5, a5 takes, and then knight g3. So this is probably fine for black. But yeah, just rook takes f4 now. It's like 2 pawns down on this side of the board. Maybe still better drawing chances than what happened in the game, to be honest. But yeah, not a very pleasant position to defend there. Okay, so I end up going bishop c5. He pushes a5. I tried g5, a6, knight b5. So my idea was to try to blockade the pawn, and maybe it's not so easy for white to break the blockade because I want to go knight a7 and then b5, and the bishop will be defending the knight. But he finds the right idea here to basically just decide the game on the spot with this move h4, just breaking up my pawns on the king side. Now if I take on h4, it's going to be rook takes f4, and his rook is just way too strong here, and this a pawn is still very strong, and I'm just going to be super passive and losing. Similar happens in the game. I played knight a7, he took here, I took on f2, rook takes f4, bishop back to c5, and then after just very accurate move, rook f7, b5, and rook b7, it's basically game over. Like black can push b4, but I have 0 moves afterwards to make any progress with the pawn. White can just keep his rook on b7, killing my counterplay with the pawn, basically dominating both of my pieces because the knight doesn't really have any good moves. The bishop has to stay in touch with both the pawn and the knight, so the bishop doesn't have any moves either, and the king is of course cut on the back rank. And even if I had somehow time to bring the king all the way to c8, well, the rook is defended, so the king is totally dominated as well. So yeah, I mean, it didn't take a long time to realize this position is just like hopeless. All white needs to do is simply bring in the king, and we'll be able to start making threats along the back rank, or even bringing the king to like d5 and can find some kind of winning breakthrough. Yeah, basically the position is totally hopeless. I tried b3. I felt like this was my only chance because I just, if my king is stuck on the back rank, it's just a very easy win for white. So I at least tried to get my king out, but it simply wasn't enough. Now the 3 pass pawns here for white are too strong, especially the a pawn. I can blockade it, but I can never attack it, and so it's just a constant nuisance for me. Meanwhile, my knight isn't able to defend against white's king coming in and supporting these pawns. So he played rook d3 here, basically stopping me from playing like bishop d4 basically. Knight c8, king g2, king g6, rook d5, and yeah, I decided just to call it quits here because well, mainly all the reasons I mentioned so far. Black has no moves, no active prospects. The knight has to stay in contact with a7, and white's plan is just super easy, just to bring in the king, eventually give a check, and yeah, there's no way black is holding this. So a good time to resign. A tough game. I was definitely unhappy with losing this one because I felt like my position from the opening was reasonable, and then at some points around move, let's say 25-26, I felt like my position was extremely comfortable, and yeah, it was a bit unfortunate that I just rejected knight a5 here, which would have given black a really comfortable advantage. And later I felt like I really spoiled the endgame because it looked worse than it really was. I thought I was in big trouble here, but there was still a way to save this position with bishop d6 that actually wasn't that hard to figure out and calculate, and I feel like I could have done this one, but yeah, sometimes you just miss out on a half point, like very by a very slight margin, and well, there's not much you can do during a tournament other than try to just accept it and like move on and try to get ready for the next game, because round 3 after this was basically just a couple hours after this game was finished. So yeah, tough loss, but you know, there was like 7 more rounds in the tournament, so I figured there's still a lot of chess to be played, and I try not to take it too seriously. All right, hopefully this video was instructive for you guys. I feel like it was not the most spectacular game to witness from Black's point of view, but still pretty interesting, I think, and my opponent definitely displayed some good technique towards the end, so hopefully it was still useful for people. All right, I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.